Of course, the knowledge that Draco Malfoy was in love with me changed nothing. He was still gone in every meaningful way, incapable of answering any of my desperate questions about why. This practicality did nothing to stop me wondering, though. I went home at sunset, my head feeling light, going over the words he'd scrawled on that scrap of parchment. How long, I couldn't help but wonder. Surely not since our days at Hogwarts. But then, when else? We'd gone our separate ways after the end of the war. I'd spoken on his behalf at trial some weeks later, but not to him. We'd been as good as strangers for over 10 years. How, when, why, my mind kept repeating, and also, still? I went over our shared memories with obsession, lying awake on my bed and staring at the ceiling. The ghoul in the attic of Grimmauld Place was wailing and banging on the pipes, but in the depths of my own thoughts I could barely hear it. Were there signs I missed? We'd always been so horrible to each other. Surely if he'd felt anything like affection, I'd have noticed. I'd always noticed everything about Draco Malfoy. My wand rattled and shrilled on my bedside table at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, startling me but not waking me up. I hadn't slept at all. "Do you have any news?" Narcissa Malfoy asked as soon as I came trudging into my office an hour later. She was standing by the window behind the desk, its normally drawn curtains pulled open and letting in the sluggish silver light of London. "I wasn't expecting you," I said, instead of something more apropos. "It's been a few weeks," she answered. She was still all in black, still with her frilly white kerchief. I'm anxious." I sighed, forced a smile, and shut my office door. "Please, sit." She sat. I produced the case file from my desk and pulled the chair against the wall over so it was beside hers. "The ambient dark magic has formed a semi-consciousness of some kind," I said. "Semi-consciousness?" "It's happened before, though it's a rare phenomenon. I told you, remember, that when dark magic doesn't have a channel, it finds negative emotions and sticks to them." I flipped through the file before I found the sketch I'd done of the too tall, shadowy figure, who in my head I'd been calling Shade like Draco had, then turned the folder around so she could see it. And in a place where powerful magic is already extant, an ancestral magical home, for instance, it can form something like self-awareness. "How dreadful," she said, sounding a little faint, but took the file and stared down at my jagged sketch, as if trying to prove to herself that she wasn't scared. I think the best word for it is hooked. It's buried itself deeply in Draco's psyche, in his guilt and grief and self-loathing, and is feeding on it." She swallowed thickly, the only sign of emotion on her otherwise impassive expression. She was still staring at my sketch. "I've had some success trying to dispel the memories it traps him in, but not as much as I'd like. I'm going to try a new variation today that I hope will separate the semi-consciousness from him long enough to draw him properly out of its grasp." "I cannot imagine," she began, but then didn't seem to know how to finish. "He's persevering," I answered, choosing my words carefully. "He's shown remarkable resilience just lasting as long as he has. I don't know that I could in his shoes." "Be honest with me." She lifted blue eyes to meet mine. "What are the odds? What is the actual likelihood that I'm going to see my son again? Hold him in my arms?" I sighed. Narcissa, I don't feel comfortable giving you numbers. This case is so singular, the magic so unusual. "Then at least tell me," she persisted, "if you have hope. Tell me if you think you can bring him home to me." I opened my mouth, then snapped it shut. It was perhaps the phrasing of the question that struck me first. After so many months of living in the haunted old wreck that was Grimmauld Place, of spiraling in self-imposed solitude, of begging myself just to get out of bed, the obvious answer should have been no. I hadn't had hope for anything in a long time. But the answer wasn't no. I thought of the desperately scratched words of Draco's letter, begging me to give him a reason to trust, and of his hand reaching out to me through the darkness. He was fighting, and as if in reflection, I was fighting too. I did have hope, and marveled at the thought. I wondered how it had snuck up on me so effectively. My mind went back to the letter. Your son writes beautifully, I wanted to say, and the desire felt absurd and true. The Malfoy Manor was being consumed slowly by ice. My first breath after apparating onto its grounds came as a huge plume of mist, and I shivered and hurried to stuff my hands into the leather gloves tucked into the pockets of my Auror robe. I had no sooner grabbed the resurrection stone off the mantelpiece when a voice came bellowing through the room. You! I turned and was somehow both surprised and not surprised by the sight of Armand hovering through the air toward me like a translucent battering ram, his expression furious. You did this. You corrupted him. You ruined him. I ground my teeth. God, I was so sick of this fucking ghost. I'm really not in the mood for this, I told him flatly. Ever since you got here, you've been nothing but trouble. Warping the veil, dragging innocent souls through to the waking world, but this! I will not allow you to corrupt my progeny any further. I'm not corrupting. God, you're insufferable. I know you're 600 years behind the times, Armand, but these days we don't burn men at the stake for falling in love with another man. He laughed scornfully. If only that were his sole deviancy. He's up there right now with in flagrante delicto. I wasn't confident of what the phrase meant, but I could make an educated guess based on what I knew of Armand and the context. Take me to him, I said uncertainly. I will not. I have no intention of setting foot back in that bedroom while he's trapped in that horrible... Even better. In that case, stay out of my way. I walked straight through him, bearing the brief flood of cold to make a point, and headed for the stairs. I passed Snape on the way up, standing against the wall on one of the steps with his arms folded behind his back. You're in for it this time, Mr. Potter, he said, voice arch. I acted as if I hadn't heard him and continued. I could tell as soon as I reached the upper landing that my hunch had been correct. The sound of it was unmistakable. Hard, ragged breaths, flesh on flesh, creaking furniture. I warned you, Snape said, who was now standing in the hallway by Draco's bedroom door. I ground my teeth and told myself that this was professional, before turning to look inside. The first thing that drew my eye was white blonde hair spilling over the side of the bed, tangled and sweat-streaked. Hands next, one pair gripping the corner of the mattress as if holding on for dear life, the other pair gripping pale, narrow hips. Then red marks on white flesh, as if someone had been grabbing at Draco's skin with intent to bruise. Then... Theodore Nott? Behind him, dark hair slick with sweat, his hips... Jesus! I said, and frantically averted my eyes. My skin felt too tight. Immediately I forgot why I came. Really? Draco and Theodore Nott? All that talk of not burning the homosexuals, Snape disparaged, and still you react like a cloistered nun at the sight of them. I don't care that he's gay. I care that I walked in on a memory of him having sex, I snapped. This is so unbelievably invasive. But seeing him slit open his wrists wasn't? I glared at him. Somehow it was easier to look at the childhood professor who died in front of me than it was... Why are you so calm about this? It's hard to muster a visceral reaction without viscera, he answered mildly. His dark eyes were focused on, but rather disinterested by, the scene over my shoulder, where he had a clear view of exactly what was happening on the bed. You know he never told his father. Told him what? That he was gay. Theodore Nott, or the weird dark magic projection of him, was enjoying himself a little too loudly. I tried desperately not to hear it. And he told you? He loved Lucius, of course, but that love always ran with an equal measure of fear, Snape continued, and canted his head to one side mildly, as if he was watching a bubbling cauldron and not his godson having sex. I think a part of him knew he'd never be able to exist authentically around him. At the very least, I never made him feel unsafe. That did sound like the Lucius Malfoy of my memory. I opened my mouth to ask when Draco had come out to him, but instead I asked, were he and not fucking in Hogwarts? This may surprise you to hear, Mr. Potter, Snape answered scornfully, but he didn't keep his godfather apprised of his sex life. That made perfect sense, and it wasn't my business anyway. I shouldn't have even asked. But I still wanted to know, so badly that it actually took me by surprise. Were he and not fucking back in Hogwarts? Surely I'd have noticed it if it had started during our 6th year, or had it not begun till I was already on the run, or even later? God, what was wrong with me? They seem to be all done, Snape said, if your fragile constitution can bear to check. Shut up, I wheezed, then very hesitantly looked over my shoulder. As promised, it was over. Draco was on his back, pale chest heaving, expression foggy with the delirium of recent orgasm. Nott, beside him, was sitting upright and rolling his back. I've got to be in London tomorrow morning for a meeting with a few investors, Nott said. His back was to me, but I could tell that he was scanning the room for discarded clothes. This building does have flu, you know, Draco answered. Does it? You certainly haven't made much use of it. Nott stood, snatched a shirt from where it had been tossed over a nearby chair. What I mean is, Draco continued, you could stay the night, if you wanted to. I even cast a charm to repel ghosts, so Armand doesn't scream at us about depravity. Nott paused, looked back over his shoulder. He seemed perplexed and mistrustful at first, before the expression shuttered with scorn. Merlin, are you really this fucking lonely? Draco flinched. I took a breath, told myself that I was a professional, and this was a formal investigation, and slowly walked inside. I decidedly did not look at the expanse of pale skin, the unbearably long legs tangled up in the bedsheets, or the crown of dark gold curls above his... Maybe, Draco said, voice vulnerable, drawing my eyes away. Can you blame me? Writing is lonely work. So do something else, Nott answered, flinty, as if you need any of the royalties. You're not some starving artist, you're one of the wealthiest people in Britain. If you want to do something else, then do it. It's not that easy, Draco answered, but he couldn't meet Nott's eyes. Of course it isn't. He folded his arms over his chest. Since Hogwarts, Theodore Nott had grown into the lean angularity of his body. He was taller than Draco by nearly 6 inches, but not a hair wider. If you went out in the world, you'd have to face the consequences of your actions, wouldn't you? And we can't have that. Draco sighed, covered his face with both hands. I drew my wand and shut my eyes to avoid being driven to distraction again. The spell I'd tried last time hadn't had quite the intended effect. This time, I'd refined it. Hopefully, with the resurrection stone on my person, it would allow me to fully enter the limbo that trapped him. Theo was still talking as I worked. Because as long as you're writing it, it's not real, right? Caroline will have her throat torn out, and Elijah will burn alive in his own home, characters paying for your actions, but you will only suffer in the sanctity of your own mind. There will never be tangible consequences for your crimes. Stop, Draco croaked. He sounded close to tears. You're lonely, Draco. You want me to spend the night, comfort you? The bed shifted. Reluctantly, I opened my eyes. Nott, still naked apart from his open shirt, had climbed between Draco's legs. His expression was hateful. Your allotted painkiller after a week's worth of self-flagellation, as if any of this is real. Stop, Draco said again, but Nott was fucking him anyway, and rage lashed in my chest, hot and sharp and startling in its intensity. The fucking is distraction. The writing is distraction. None of it's real. If you were interested in reality, you'd confront the real consequences of your real crimes. But instead, here we are. You take my cock and you write your stories and you tell yourself any of it means anything. Stop, Draco cried, and Not's mouth was full of jagged teeth like Caroline's husband, and he held Draco down and bit hard into his neck, intent to tear his throat out just like Caroline's, and I hurried to finish my spell, which threw me headfirst into Draco Malfoy, in more ways than one. I withdrew my face from his neck and felt hot blood running down my chin. A bite wound, fresh and red, was leaking onto the white sheets beneath him. Grey eyes, swallowed by dark pupils, stared up at me in shock. I could feel the press of his legs against my hips and... oh fuck. Quite literally, I was literally oh-fucking him. What? Draco breathed, terrified and bewildered, and feeling absolutely incredible around my cock, warm and yielding and slick. I stammered, I swear there is a rational explanation for this. I shifted, intending to pull out, but stumbled and slid back home, and Draco's face contorted with a sudden jolt of pleasure, and he was making this fantastic little sound and writhing and, oh god, this was actually happening. Was this happening? This shouldn't be happening, right? I should... Harry, he whimpered, and my blood was on fire, and I wanted him. A realization that I told myself I would tackle later. You're hurt, I said. Kiss me, he answered, and I did. I kissed him, and I slid my arms around his back, and fucked him. I hadn't ever had sex with a man before. Apparently I'd been missing out. Draco's fingers were points of bruising pressure on my shoulders, his legs winding around my hips and encouraging me deeper, so I went deeper. His body was pliant and hot and perfect, and as my hips found rhythm, he answered in kind, breathing in time with each thrust as a gasp against my mouth. My blood burned in my veins. It felt so good. He felt so good that it almost defied description. I gasped when, after a few minutes or 1,000 years, I could feel the crescendo of nearing climax vibrating through my bones. Draco, he answered and gripped my hips harder with his legs and kissed me and kissed me and kissed me, and he tasted like tea and blood and smelled like ink, and I gripped him hard against my body and came so powerfully that for a time I was blind and deaf. When at last my senses came back to me, when I opened my eyes he was still there. The enchantment to pull me into the limbo had worked, perhaps a little too well. Is this real? He asked, still breathless. My forehead was pressed to his, and I could see every detail of his fragile, frantic hope. Are you real? Or is this just another torment? He began babbling, terrified. Shade, if this is some trick, I warn you this would break me, end your feast forever. I couldn't... Not him. It's real, I interjected. Draco, it's real. I'm real. He sat up, scrambling, grey eyes huge and dilated. Our bodies disentangled. I was a little too aware of the sudden absence of his heat, and some small part of me yearned to bury myself in it, in him all over again. How, he said, voice hitched and breath ragged, how did you... A very particularly designed dispel combined with an enchantment to... I huffed an aggrieved sigh. In the time it would take me to explain the magical theory behind the magic, I could get us both out. I'm an Auror, Draco. This is literally my job. I came in so I could get you out. He stared, eyes going glassy with tears. I got your note, I said. I hadn't meant to. The words had slipped out. I got your answer. His voice wobbled. It seems impossible that even after everything you could find forgiveness. Of course it seems impossible. You've been living in a house full of dark magic for over a decade. It's been eating away at your sense of self-worth. But Draco, the war was years ago, and I meant what I said. You were just a child. His breath stuttered. Despite the dark closeness of the bedroom, he remained somehow radiant, a beacon of marmoreal skin and flaxen hair. With his weight resting on the arms he displayed behind him, the flat expanse of his chest was laid bare, along with several long, thin scars, I said. How had I not noticed them before? Those scars on your chest, are they? I should get dressed, he answered, sounding winded. I'd rather you didn't, I almost replied, but instead forced myself to nod dumbly. I watched as he climbed out of bed and snatched a dressing gown, long and satiny and dark, from where it had been hung on the ajar door of the armoire. You have a plan, I hope? He asked, his back to me as he secured the tie with an artless double knot on his hip. To get me out? I meant to do some experiments, I said, to see what level of physicality you had in here. I suppose those questions have been answered, considering I had literally been inside him mere moments ago. The atmosphere shifted and his shoulders tensed. This place, it has a way of contorting your emotions, he said. It casts shadows and twists them to its liking. What happened just now? Alarmed, I suddenly sat up. Did I hurt you? He glanced at me nervously over his shoulder. His answer was slow to arrive and pronounced carefully. No, you didn't hurt me. I hesitated. It wasn't against your will at all? No. He was still speaking so carefully. Was it against yours? No. It was many things. Confusing, alarming, wonderful, bewildering, but not unwilling. Oh. The grandfather clock at the far end of the hall outside chimed. There was a candle on the window-sill by the armoire that lit his profile with gold, calling attention to the slight upward turn of his nose, the aristocratic arch of his cheekbones, and the impossible length of his neck. I was struck by a moment of disarming clarity. Draco Malfoy was beautiful, and always had been, and a part of me had always known. God, it was hard to speak. It's good that you have some physicality, even in this place. It means that there's something left to draw out. We should act fast, he said. The shade is never lax for long. I looked down at myself, hesitated, then conjured my aura robes. It would have to do. I climbed unsteadily out of bed and turned my attention to the location where I'd cast my initial spell on the other side of the veil. The spell left me, or should have left me. I could feel it with some effort, a little thread of energy that drew the tip of my wand toward it like a magnet. There, I should be able to pull us back through. I turned and gestured him over with a jerk of my hand. He hesitated, then approached, stepping uncertainly into the lamplight pooling around his desk. My eyes went, rather without my intent, down the length of his hair, back to his throat. The bite has stopped bleeding, at least. It doesn't, usually, he said. I've lived through this particular nightmare a few times. His first bite always slashes my windpipe right open. I wanted to ask how much of that conversation had been real, and how much of it had been the shade twisting it. I wanted to ask if Nott had been right in his assessment that Draco was punishing his characters in lieu of himself. Instead, I asked, Theodore Nott, by the way? Really? He frowned, nose wrinkling. I'll thank you not to pass judgment. He was such a prick in school. So are you. I laughed, just once, and, despite myself, felt helplessly, unbearably charmed, a feeling that only cemented when the corner of Draco's mouth lifted into an uncertain smile. Give me your hand, I said, and held mine out to him. A nervous breath passed between us before he took it. His skin was soft and cool. My thumb found a writer's callus on his ring finger. My wand, still tethered to that thin strand of energy, fought me as I moved it in a broad arc, whispering the long lines of the incantation. As I worked, the world around us began to wobble and warp, with more intensity as the magic coalesced. After a time I heard Draco whisper, It's back. The shade. I didn't dare to do more than open my eyes a fraction, but a fraction was enough. There it was, just on the other side of the open bedroom door, looming so tall that its whole back bent to one side as if snapped in half. My heart thudded against the wall of my chest. I kept chanting. The shade took one step forward, knees bending backward, whole body shambling. Another step. It reached forward, two long fingers snapping and twitching into unnatural positions as they reached out toward us. I finished my chant with a shout, dragged Draco's body against my own, and pushed. I landed hard, with a loud thump and a plume of dust rising off the floor. Draco landed beside me, I could see, but there was no sound for him nor any dust. He landed silently, form flickering. I sat upright, wrenched around. The shade was gone, or at least it was for now. I looked back down at Draco. He was sitting now too, and staring at his own hands as they flickered and flashed, as if bursting through with static. "What is—" he began, but then didn't finish. Shit. I reached out to touch him. For a split second I found purchase on his wrist, but it was over quickly, and my grip slid through as though he'd melted away at my touch. "I think I was trapped too long," Draco said, horrified. Even his voice was insubstantial, choppy and uneven, almost tinny. "I murdered, and it took so much of me." "Hey, it's all right." I swallowed down my fear. I can figure something out. I'm not giving up just yet." He lifted his eyes to meet mine. We were sat so close together. Even wavering and insubstantial, his eyes were so unbearably grey, almost silvery. Unthinking, I reached one hand up to him. It found his face, or parts of it, little fragments of skin appearing and disappearing under my fingertips. That little niggling thing I'd been pushing down threatened, rising in the back of my mind the longer I stared. I wanted him. Even free from the confines of the nightmare, even when he was barely physical, I wanted him. "I'll figure it out," I said again, even as I ached for substance. I wanted to tangle my fingers in his hair and grip bruises into his ribs. "You are," he answered, faltering, "a very dedicated Auror." I wasn't. Or had been at one point, but not for a long time. This was something else. No! We both turned. Armand was hovering at the top of the stairs, alight with fury. I groaned, dragged myself to my feet. "This far and no further," he railed. "It's bad enough that he has disgraced his name and defiled his body." "Man, and not this shit again," Draco sighed, also rising. "Armand, for the last time." "You expect me to stand idly by and watch as you ruin your bloodline? You're a stain on your house, corrupted, indecent." "My bloodline was ruined long before I started having sex with men." Far past Armand, at the very end of the dark hallway, a shadow loomed. "Thousands of years of pure breeding, generations upon generations of carefully cultivated genes, and for what?" "For nothing. It never meant anything, Armand." And loomed, taller and taller. It was staring not at Draco, but at me. It was a farce from the start, a way to pretend at importance, a reason to commit violence and control others. One shambling step forward. 2. "You dishonor your bloodline by lying with filth." "And you dishonor yourself by espousing it." A burst of magic, a wailing shriek. Draco had banished Armand. But I could not look away from the shade. I could not shake the feeling that, for the first time, I was no longer a distraction to it, but prey.